Hey family, I'm Alan, one of our downtown pastors. If you're new and you've just recently found our church over the past few months, we would love to connect you to our church family. Please fill out the online connect card found on the homepage of our website so someone can get in touch with you this week. With the holidays approaching, here are some important dates and information to share with you. First of all, coming up on Sunday, November 22nd, we are hosting our monthly night of prayer and worship. It'll be 5 p.m. in the parking lot of our downtown church. Make sure that you bring a chair and an electronic device with you. At this gathering, we are also partnering with Daybreak Crisis Pregnancy Center. They're one of our Serve the City partnerships, and we want to help meet a couple of their needs. First of all, we are collecting diapers, wipes, formula, and maternity clothes. For diapers, size 4, 5, and 6 are really the biggest needs. Secondly, Daybreak is also looking for mommy mentors, mothers who can come alongside new and expectant mothers to build relationships with them once a week via phone call or in person. Mentorship is a 1-year commitment, and they're in search of Christian moms to serve in this capacity. To find out more, go to our events page. Normally, we welcome people to join us on Thursdays at 12 p.m. for our weekly sermon recording. But this week is going to be Thanksgiving. So on November the 26th, there will be no live recording. Lastly, I want to mention to you our Advent guides. We have written an Advent guide to help prepare our hearts for the Christmas season. It's a 5-week-long devotional guide for you and your life group to work through during this season. Life group leaders should be distributing those out to everyone in their group over the next few days. But if you haven't received a hard copy yet, you are welcome to pick up one of the copies at any of our on-campus events. These guides are first come, first serve, and the suggested donation price is $6 per copy. But if that's an issue for you, don't worry about it. We'd rather that you have it and be blessed by it. I love you, church family, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Hey Midtown family, I'm Nicole from Midtown Downtown. Today's scripture reading is from Matthew chapter 7, verses 12 through 23 and verses 24 through 28. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Beware of false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching. This is the word of the Lord.
So today we finally come to the conclusion of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And I know that many of us are thinking, finally, we've been in this for 15 weeks on 3 chapters. And look, I get it. I know that is a long time to spend in what seems like such a small chunk of text. And to be honest, we probably could have done more. Like if I'm just being straight with you, we probably could have done a lot more, but we're not going to. Today we're going to jump down into the conclusion of Jesus' sermon. Now, you might expect that that he would conclude his teaching on his way, on what it means to be a disciple of Jesus and live life in his kingdom, that he would conclude his grand sermon with something inspirational. Perhaps a really touching story that maybe moves us to tears, or a nice pep talk with three like alliterated points at the end that really rally us to action, like the 3 P's to following the way of Jesus, or something like that might be how you expect someone to end a sermon. But that is actually not at all how Jesus ties the bow on his Sermon on the Mount. What Jesus does instead is he gives us this series of 3 images that really serve as 3 warnings that force his audience into a decision, that force his audience to wrestle with the question, what will you do with everything that you have heard? What will you do with all of this that you have heard? And what I hope we actually see for us today is that same question is what Jesus' sermon is going to leave us to wrestle with as well. Here's how Jesus concludes. This is what he says. He says there are only 2 paths that you can take, 2 voices that you can listen to, and 2 foundations that you can build your life on. And you will choose, so choose wisely. Let's get in. We're going to jump into the first image that there are 2 paths that you can take. We're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 13. This is what Jesus says. He says, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. So Jesus begins with this imagery of gates and ways, and this would honestly have made a lot of sense to Jesus' original audience. So in the ancient world, cities were protected by walls and gates, all right? You could only enter the city through its gate, and depending on which gate you took, it would lead you to different places. So for example, in ancient Jerusalem, there were gates like the Damascus Gate, which was originally called the Northern Gate, and it led you to and from cities in the north, like Damascus. There was the Sheep Gate, later named Herod's Gate, and it was a gate that led to the city market where livestock and other goods would be sold. There was even one called the Dung Gate, and I'll just let you use your imaginations to figure out what that one was actually used for. But the point being was that the gate that you entered determined the road you would take and where you would go. Now, obviously, what Jesus is doing here is he is using this term metaphorically to talk about a way of life or a way of living. He says that when it comes to life, there are only 2 paths, 2 gates, 2 ways that you can take. One is wide and one is narrow. One is easy and one is hard. One is what most people will take, and one only a few actually find. One leads to destruction, and one leads to life. And Jesus means for his audience to understand that it's his way that is the narrow way that leads to life. That his way is the way to life. That life is only found in and through him. That Jesus' way is not a way among many ways, but Jesus is the way. And this is something of a side note. This is not at all what this sermon is about, but I know some of us might hear that and think, how on earth can Jesus say that? Like, that is incredibly exclusive, Jesus. What are you doing? And the answer is he can say that. He has the authority to say that because he is the one who rose from the grave, right? He is the one he has the authority to say this because he is the one that actually beat death, proving once and for all that he is exactly who he said he is. The one who through his life, death, and resurrection has come to make right everything that sin made wrong, including you and I, that Jesus is the one and the only one who actually solved the problem of creation by doing what we could not do for ourselves, by paying the penalty for sin and then defeating its power to deliver us to new life, right? The truth is were that not true, there really wouldn't be much reason to listen to Jesus. If those things had not actually happened, there wouldn't be a whole lot of reason to listen to him. He would be just another voice in the ocean of philosophy throughout human history. But as we like to say it around here, because Jesus is alive, that changes absolutely everything. But his primary point here is that to take his way, to choose the narrow gate, to choose the way of Jesus, will not be a simple or an easy endeavor. It will not be a simple or easy path. Here's what he means. Do you know what's easy? Anger and bitterness are easy. It's easy to take offense at something someone said or did and live in anger towards them. But at the end of the day, what lies at that isn't life, but what lies behind that is, or what lies at the end of that is a self-made prison of misery and relational dysfunction. A life of forgiveness and reconciliation is hard, right? They require something of us. They challenge us. They make us uncomfortable, but they are a way of life that receive peace and freedom from drama and relational breakdown. A way of life that opens up the door for deep, meaningful relationships that can actually withstand the test of time and conflict. What's easy is believing that money, status, or the ability to control my circumstances, whatever they may be, my kids, my career, my relationships, whatever, what's easy is to believe that these are the key to my happiness and security. It's easy to operate as though everything actually depends on me. But that really only leads to the oppressive slavery of worry and fear and the insatiable desire, the insatiable drive to control more, to have more, to get more. What's hard is trusting God with those things and seeking first his kingdom above all else. That's the hard thing. It requires sacrifice and self-denial and trust, often trust in the face of uncertainty. But at the end of it, it's also a life that finds peace and contentment and security and freedom in the God of the universe instead of the insecure nature of money, status, and ever-changing circumstances. What's easy is just looking the part on the outside. Just being the person who periodically shows up to church or to life group, who asks for a few vague prayer requests, usually about somebody else or for somebody else instead of for ourselves, or sharing a few inspirational quotes here and there online, and that just kind of being it. But at the end of the day, all that is a life that ends up being religious looking, but shallow and empty and likely pretty insecure itself. What's hard is a life of real communion with God. A life that abides with God and is about what he's about on planet Earth and in ourselves. A life that is built on his presence and his pleasure. That's hard. That requires something of us. It demands to be lived differently, but it's also a life that finds joy and rest in the eternal approval and fullness of God instead of the ever-changing opinions of other people. And these are all things that Jesus has unpacked in his Sermon on the Mount. These are all things that we've heard him say over and over again for the past 14 weeks. Calling us to a way of life that uproots anger and division with reconciliation and forgiveness. A way of life that puts an end to objectification by treating all of humanity with honor and dignity as image bearers of God. A way of life that dismantles hate and violence and oppression with the radical love for our neighbor, even those who would consider themselves our enemies. A way of living that casts aside pretentiousness and religious performance, but finds pleasure and enjoyment in God alone. A life of security and peace and hope in God. A life that is freed from the tyranny of anxiety and fear and judgment. A way of life that blesses the world and draws it to God. Essentially, life as it was intended to be. And life as we want it. And when Jesus invites us into or through the narrow gate, it's an invitation to trust him and walk in this life. It's an invitation to trust him and receive this life, but he makes it no secret. To choose this way is to choose the hard thing. To choose this way is to choose the hard thing. Good things are rarely easy, whatever they may be. A marriage, a career, a family, a healthy mind and body. Good things are rarely easy, and easy things are rarely good. And the truth of the matter is that following Jesus is no different. The point that Jesus is making here is that the life of true discipleship is one that passes day by day through the narrow gate of trusting Jesus and walking the decidedly uneasy road of the Sermon on the Mount. However, the problem that Jesus addresses next is that there will be voices who try to tell you that it doesn't have to be that way. There will be voices that try to tell you it doesn't have to be that way. His second image is that there are two voices you can listen to. Let's pick up in verse 15. He says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, you will recognize them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Now, we won't spend a ton of time here because I believe we all kind of understand what Jesus is saying, but this idea of prophet is not a title or a word that we use a ton in our context, much less the idea of false prophets, but it's a fairly big idea in Jewish thought. So prophets were those who basically served as guides to the good life, right? They were signposts indicating that this is what God says, this is what God does, and this is what God wants, all right? And in this sense, Jesus is something of a prophet. Now, these days, we might not call them prophets, okay? We might call them philosophers or psychologists or therapists or counselors or podcasters or pastors, but regardless, we still have people who function in this type of role, who say, this is what you really need for the good life, who say, this is where the good life is really found. This is what the world really needs, and here's what you really need in order for you to really flourish. And Jesus' point here is to beware, literally to be on the lookout, because there will be those who claim to carry his name, who appear to be Christian, perhaps even especially Christian, who really aren't. That their message, their advice, their wisdom is not in line with the way of Jesus. And he says they aren't always easy to spot. He says sometimes they look like wolves in sheep's clothing. In fact, the smartest wolves are the ones that appear to be sheep, that give the appearance like they belong. And the only way to actually tell the difference is in the fruit that they bear. The test is not in how they seem or in how they appear. The test is in their life and their teaching. This is what he means by fruit. Does their life and teaching follow the pattern and the way of Jesus? Does it resemble and point others to the narrow gate or the wide way? The truth is, you will always be able to find people who tell you what you want to hear. People who tell you that you can have Jesus and the wide path too. In fact, I would argue that it's a pretty lucrative endeavor in our society to tell people this. Very practically speaking, what this means for us as followers of Jesus is that every book that you read, every person that you listen to or podcast you subscribe to that carries the label Christian may not actually point people to the way of Jesus. Many, and I mean many, so-called Christian influencers out there are doing nothing but peddling the wide gate and the easy way. They are like dangerous versions of Mary Poppins, a spoonful of sugar that helps the heresy go down. At the risk of saying too much, to be quite honest, some of you need to stop washing your face and get on the road to Jesus and not the road back to you. And if you want to be fierce-free and full of fire, you're not going to find that by embracing glorious you, but rather by losing yourself in glorious Jesus. And listen, if that misses you, I'm sorry, but if you know, you know. The point being, if we intend to follow Jesus, we must take care how and to whom we listen, because there will be plenty of people, famous or not, who will tell you that you can enter through the narrow gate and still take the wide path too. You will find plenty of people who will tell you this, that you can hold the way of Jesus and the way of everything else in one big happy hug, who say to you things like, yes, you can follow Jesus. You can follow Jesus, but when it comes to your relationships and sex, Jesus would want you to follow your heart, especially if you're older than you want to be and still single. Yes, you can follow Jesus, but your sin is not the biggest problem here. The biggest problem is actually other people's sin. Your biggest problem is that you're too hard on yourself. Yes, you can follow Jesus, but Jesus doesn't expect that to really cost you anything. Certainly not your dreams or your standard of living or the opportunities that you want to give your kids. He understands that those things have to come first. In fact, he wants them to. And the option will always be before us to listen to that voice that offers the wide gate and the easy way, or the voice of Jesus that says, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And if I may, I think that part of the reason why so many of us struggle to discern the difference between the two is because if we're honest, we aren't all that familiar with what Jesus actually says. And that matters because as Jesus' final image concludes, only one of those voices is going to take us where we actually want to go. His last image is there are two foundations that you can build your life on. Verse 24. He says, everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like the foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. In Jesus' third and final image, he compares the person who builds their life on his teachings with those who don't. He says the wise person chooses the difficult thing and builds his life on the voice of Jesus. But the unwise, the Greek word moros, where we actually get our word from moron, takes the easy way and builds his life on something else. If you've ever done any construction or remodeling or anything like that, you know this, that there always comes a point in the project where you can choose to do something the right way, a way that will be harder and likely more costly, or you can cut a corner. You can do something not quite up to code and hope for the best. One is the hard but wise choice, and the other one is risky. And from the outside, the finished product might look exactly the same. But when disaster strikes, it gets exposed. When disaster strikes, something breaks and the shoddy workmanship gets exposed, and it winds up honestly costing more in the long run than if you had done it right the first time. And this is how Jesus says it will be for those who do or do not build their lives on his way. That when the flood comes, only one of these houses is going to be left standing. The flood here represents suffering and hardship, which can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. The loss of health, the loss of a job, a loved one, financial need, or even the death of a dream. And Jesus is simply being brutally honest here. He's saying life will be hard, that even the easy path isn't just going to be easy. Both houses will go through the flood. Both foundations are going to be tried, but only one can withstand what life is going to throw at it. You see, the way of Jesus doesn't lead us out of hardship. It actually leads us through it. The flood will come, and it will shake your house to the core. And it will reveal to you what your life was built on. And for some of us, that is either going to be the happiest day or the saddest day of our entire life. Because every other foundation will ultimately fail. If you build your life on success, on getting ahead, no matter what the cost, on beauty, on sex or youth, or popularity or pleasure, or the freedom to go and do whatever you want, whenever you want. If your life is even built on your kids or your family or your spouse, rather than built on Jesus and his way to be human, it will, quote, fall, and great will that fall be. Because all of those other things are just fleeting. They can all be taken away in an instant, and thus can't withstand the pressure of what life will throw at it. You know, I imagine to one degree or another, like we've all had front row seats in some respects to watch this play out in the lives of others, maybe even ourselves. A family member, a coworker, a boss. If not them, bare minimum, a celebrity or somebody famous, both inside and outside of the church on the internet, whose life was built on a faulty foundation, and then it just imploded. And it's not always a crisis or a scandal. Sometimes it's just a slow unraveling, right? Just a cumulative effect of a life not built around Jesus and his way that just finally starts to catch up with someone, that finally starts to just get exposed. Like Paul writes to Timothy, the sins of some are obvious and go ahead of them, but the sins of others trail behind. He's saying for some people, you don't see it for a while. Everything looks peachy. The house looks good on the outside, but beneath the surface, the foundation is off. And when the flood comes, it catches up to them. A rejection of Jesus' teaching to not find our identity in the praise of others, but in the approval of God in Christ. It just slowly gives way to a life that gets consistently marked by depression and insecurity. A rejection of Jesus' teaching to trust God over and above material wealth and control that just gives way to crippling anxiety and fear about the future. A rejection of Jesus' teaching to forgive as we have been forgiven that gives way to a life of bitterness and anger and resentment, perhaps leading some to be marked in their twilight years, years that should be filled with joy and peace of passing down a legacy of a life well lived, to instead be marked with a sourness and a hatred for others and what's around them. A rejection of Jesus' teaching against objectification that gives way to things like porn addiction, affairs, or just an endless stream of relationships and marriages in search of fulfillment, leaving a wake of destruction in its path. This is Jesus' point. You can choose to live in such a way that you experience destruction and will experience more in the future, or you can live in such a way that you will experience life and experience more in the future. One is wise and leads to life. One is foolish and leads to destruction. The choice simply is yours. The choice is yours. We must make a decision about what our way will be. Will it be Jesus's or will it be something else? And real simply, this is just where Jesus ends his Sermon on the Mount. He just lets it drop right here. He just stops unapologetically, leaving his audience at a crossroads to have to sort through the questions. What path will they take? What voice will they listen to? What foundation will they build on? Essentially, what will they do with everything they have just heard? And Jesus' conclusion forces the exact same crossroads on you and I as well. You must decide, what path will you take? What voice will you listen to? What foundation will you build your life on? And make no mistake, to make no choice is to make a choice. We all choose every day. We have to choose. And now I know all of that might sound really bold and direct to you, like, dang, Jesus, ease up a little bit. But to be quite honest with you, that is exactly how his audience heard him as well. Look in verse 28. It says, and when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, not as their scribes. They knew this is what he was leaving them with. The choice to follow him and him alone or not. There was no in between. Jesus was not like their scribes saying, here's one possible interpretation, but here also is another. No, it was, this is the way. Will you take it? But it's important to note that Jesus is not forcing this issue because he's angry with us or something like that, but rather like a father who raises his voice when his children run into the street. Jesus is raising his voice here, not because he's angry, but because he loves us, because he loves you. He is confronting us on this because he loves us. He loves us too much to let us walk down the same patterns of behavior that brought destruction on our parents and on us. He loves us too much to watch us destroy our lives by chasing things that won't last. He loves us too much to let us miss out on life to the full. He loves us too much to let us take the easy way. Throughout this entire series, hear me on this, Jesus might be challenging you in any number of ways in how you handle your money, your relationships, your politics. Perhaps even just challenging you to stop thinking that following him is just some sort of cute idea, but something that he is very, very serious about. The list could go on. But in all of that, it is because he wants life for you. He wants life for you. He wants good for you. But you need to hear this. These warnings from Jesus ought to wake you up. These warnings ought to wake us up. They ought to get us asking the hard questions of ourselves and to ask ourselves to take a long, hard look at our own discipleship to Jesus. My honest prayer for us as we end this series is that these warnings would arrest our hearts, to be quite honest. Because it is far too easy to get lulled to sleep, believing that because we believe certain things are true and do a few Christian-looking things, that's all it means to be on the way of Jesus. One of my great fears for you, and honestly for me for that matter, is that we would spend our 80 years here following paths and building lives on foundations that won't last, all while convincing ourselves that Jesus co-signs it. And hear me. Some of you have called yourself a Christian all of your life. And that is because you grew up with it and you loosely believe that the story is true. But to be a Christian is to enter through the narrow gate and to follow the rough path. To be a Christian is to listen and bear fruit according to the voice of Jesus. To be a Christian is to build your life on the person, work, and teachings of Jesus. In short, to be a Christian is both to have faith and to follow the way of Jesus of Nazareth. In fact, faith and following are simply two sides of the same coin. You don't have one without the other. And at the end of the day, you have to decide what your way will be. You have to decide who you will follow. I can't decide for you. As much as I wish I could. Listen, there are about 10 to 15 people right now that I wish I could decide for, but I can't. And it's not about what you say. It's about how you actually build your life. What you say to me after this sermon, honestly, it doesn't really matter that much. What you tell people about how you build your life or what path you'll take, honestly, that doesn't matter all that much. What you actually do with the teachings of Jesus is what matters. How you actually build your life is what matters here. What you actually do tomorrow and the next day, that's what I'm talking about. Not what you say you will do tomorrow or the next day, or what you know you probably ought to do but don't do tomorrow or the next day. As James says, that we would be doers of the word and not merely hearers only. There is freedom and joy available, but hear me, it is on the hard path. It is through the narrow gate. There aren't a lot of people there. There is an easier and more popular way, but the flood is coming. So choose wisely. You have the teachings of Jesus. Now, what will you do with them?